Um, it gives me great pleasure to be here with you all this morning to talk about the work of Smashing Times. My name is Mary Moynihan, and I'm a writer, theatre and filmmaker and artistic director of the Smashing Times International Centre for the Arts and Equality. And I want to thank the organisers of the Resource Fair for including Smashing Times in this event, and it's a great pleasure to be involved as it's a very exciting adventure. Smashing Times was set up in 1991 as a professional organisation using the arts to promote equality, human rights and diversity. And from the beginning, storytelling was a key part of what we do. So we use theatre workshops, theatre performances, films, panel discussions, books and art exhibitions to tell stories that promote human rights, equality and diversity. And theatre and film are often the places we go to on a voluntary basis to hear someone else's story. We give ourselves permission to step into someone else's shoes. And through the arts, we can tell stories that can raise awareness of equality and diversity, but also inspire new visions for a shared and inclusive future for all. And it's a great pleasure to be able to use the arts to explore historical memory work as a form of storytelling. And with regards to Smashing Times, we have worked in Northern Ireland from the 1990s, since before the ceasefires, and we have continued our work in a post-conflict environment after peace was established, using the arts to promote peace building and reconciliation. And a key part of the work is bringing communities together with a focus on storytelling and using a theatre-based storytelling workshop to tell hidden or denied stories of conflict, and at the same time finding ways to link those stories to discussion on how we can create a more diverse narrative and create new visions for a shared future. And owing to our successful work in Northern Ireland, bringing communities together, Smashing Times was invited by different organisations to work across Europe. And for example, we had European colleagues who were at the coalface of the refugee displacement of people. And so we came together using the skills that had been built, bringing the arts to a peace building programme, using those skills then to promote anti-racism, gender equality and inclusion. And this work has proved highly successful across Europe, where the models we have designed are continuing to be used to promote awareness of the issues that can help build stable, inclusive societies. So, for example, work we have done in the past would be to design training programs that are arts focused. And we designed a program called Drama for Change, which was a curriculum developed from a 3-year Erasmus funded program. And that was using theatre to promote anti-racism, gender equality and inclusion. And then as part of the work, in addition to training programs, we are then using stories that have been gathered from historical memory to create performances, to create films, to create books, and then displaying that work online or with communities. So bringing communities together, looking at the stories, looking at the films, reading the books, and then taking part in workshops and using that work to then stimulate discussion on how we can promote equality today. And as part of this work, the company has decided that historical memory is very important, because the idea of using stories from the past to inform what's happening today can be a very exciting way to raise awareness of key issues in communities. So, for example, in 2016, in the Republic of Ireland, Smashing Times were asked, would we consider exploring women's stories from 1916? And I like to mention this because initially, when we were asked to do this, we thought there was very few women involved in the 1916 Easter Rising. But as we now know, there were over 300 women who took part. And in a way, discovering those stories was like lifting an invisibility blanket, because very often women's stories and history are hidden or denied. And I definitely think there has been a change in recent years from the 1970s onwards, where historians, both male and female, are starting to put women's stories back into the historical narrative. However, I still think we have a long way to go, because we still don't have a telling of women's stories from history on a 50-50 basis, which would be important for inspiring young people to have equal role models, to inspire them to become actively engaged in their own communities. And what was interesting about the 1916 stories was that we discovered that the women who were involved in this historical event were not just fighting for freedom. Many of the women were also fighting for social justice, which was very interesting. They were actively campaigning for women's rights, but also for the rights of others. So to not just bring freedom, but to radically change society, to have a focus on equality and human rights. And we developed the digital art exhibition called Women's Voices Then and Now. And this exhibition takes inspiration from women's stories from 1916, but also from all the major events happening in the 1916 to 1923 period in Irish history. So, for example, it's all about looking at pioneering women in the island of Ireland. And we explore women's stories from the 1918 Centenary Vote for Women, the Civil War, the War of Independence, and the founding years of the Irish Free State. And as well as using those stories or displaying them online, we're also highlighting the voices of artists and citizens as they reflect on the stories coming out of the decade of centenaries. And I think that's really important, because what we can do is use these stories to engage people in discussion and debate around what freedom means to us today, what equality means to us today, how far has society changed, and what kind of change would we like to create in a peaceful, non-violent way working into the future. And with regards to our Women's Voices Then and Now digital art exhibition, which is displayed on the Smashing Times website, we have 4 parts to the exhibition. So part 1 is the Easter Rising, part 2 refers to the suffragette movement and telling stories of women from both Ireland and England who were involved in the campaign to give women the right to vote. Part 3 is about the Civil War and the founding of the Irish Free State. And part 4 refers to the voices of artists and also people from local communities today. Because I would always see the work as a circle, that we may bring historical memory and bring how we've used the stories from historical memory to create artworks, but then bringing up those artworks to local communities. In many cases, creating the artworks through and with the local communities arising out of the stories. So the stories are inspiration to work with communities to create dialogue today around visions for the future. And there's a couple of women I would like to mention. So, for example, one woman that I might focus on was Anna Haslam, who was a key figure in the 19th and early 20th century women's movement in Ireland. And she was a Quaker from Cork and very much into equality between men and women, as was her husband, Thomas. And I think that's interesting, because while I'm talking about women's stories, you often discover different narratives in history and a different way of looking at history when you look at women's stories. But you also find that there's different narratives from male stories in history when you look at it through the perspective of a gender lens. That can be very interesting. And Anna was very active in Ireland. She was a supporter of unionism, but she believed in bringing women from many different traditions together in Ireland to campaign for a woman's right to vote. And of course, at that time, in the early 20th century, women were not allowed to vote, and any changes had to be made through the all-male parliament at Westminster. So you had women campaigning. Anna would have been sometimes referred to as a suffragist because she would have used less radical or less militant means to campaign. So it would have been lobbying and advocating with the MPs to make change. But she became friends with many of the women then who, when they saw no change was happening, started to take on more radical tactics known as the suffragettes, and women such as Hannah Sheehy Skeffington. And it's very interesting that, for example, Anna was very much all about reaching out and bringing different traditions together. So, for example, she brought Isabella Todd, who was a suffragette from Northern Ireland, from Belfast, very much into women's rights and a unionist campaigner. And Isabella came to Dublin to give a talk around the women's suffrage movement. And I just like that idea of, when you look at these stories, you have women from different sides, but yet finding ways to reach out and connect with each other. And it's possibly a different way of looking at history and telling a different narrative around history. And I think what's important about the stories of Isabella Todd, of Hannah Sheehy Skeffington, of Anna Haslam, is that we see the way that women, despite living in a society that was oppressive to women's rights, these women didn't accept that, and they all stood up in their own way. So going back to that point about where women weren't just fighting for freedom, they were fighting much more for a view of society that was about how we treat each other. And I think that's really important to look at those types of stories. And I think then going forward, it's important to find ways to continue to engage with local communities about how we can find the stories that still haven't been told. So, for example, as I said, I do think that stories of women are more and more being told, but I still believe that there are many, many stories out there that still have to be brought out of that liminal space that they are living in and waiting to be told in order to reach a wider community. There's wonderful stories such as, the suffragettes and writer from Northern Ireland, Elizabeth McCracken, Florrie Sandys, an Englishwoman who fought with the Siberian army during World War I, and who was awarded the King George Star, which is the Serbian military's highest decoration. And she was actually promoted to Sergeant Major. And I think, again, it's looking at stories because this difficult question comes up of how do we not glorify violence as part of our remembrance. And I suppose my own approach to that has been that I'm interested in a diversity or a plurality of stories, and that I want to go in and tell many different stories. And I always find as an artist it's important to make sure that we're always asking what story is not being told. Are we just telling one side? Are we just taking one tradition? We need to look at all stories, bring different stories together, and enable this plurality of voices to be heard and a diversity of voices to be heard. And I think I have found that's something that particularly strikes young people. They love these stories from history. And when you get them talking about the different stories, they start to think about connections on a human level between what unites people as well as what divides people, and to generate discussions around that, which can be very interesting in terms of encouraging young people to explore, again, human rights from their own perspective today, and this idea of equality and inclusion. And I suppose looking at the stories from the decade of centenaries, I think it's important to highlight the fact, as people know, that women were very active during this period, and there's many stories to tell. But once the decade of centenaries was over, particularly in the Irish Free State, women's rights were denied, and women were effectively living in what has been described, for example, by Hannah Sheehy Skeffington as a fascist approach to the treatment of women. And I think it's the same in, the founding of the Northern Ireland state, that initially it had been very much a male narrative, and very much strictly gendered. And I think it's important that we don't accept that as the telling of history, that history may tell us women were not active, but yet when you go in and find the hidden stories, you realise underneath there's huge activism taking place. And going forward, that would be very important. As part of our work, which I think is interesting, Smashing Times, based on looking at the decade of centenaries, then decided to look at women's stories from World War II. And again, we found this interesting from a perspective of living on an island, that there were the divisions between people who, the Republic of Ireland being so-called neutral, and then people being involved on the side of the Allies to stand up against the threat of Nazism. And we have found, for example, with stories from the Republic, that while Ireland may have been neutral, many people, Irish people, weren't, and many Irish people did go and become involved in the campaign to stand up to totalitarianism across Europe and to express solidarity with their European countries and counterparts. And again, what fascinates me about those stories, there's many stories of women such as Mary Elms, and we've all these stories on various books on our website, which people can see. But again, what I found interesting about the stories were the stories I was drawn to were ones where we're hearing about people who are willing to sacrifice their lives in non-violent ways as well as in more militant ways for the rights of others. And I think that whole area is something we need to continue to debate about, this idea of what is needed in terms of our responsibilities in society to stand up for the rights of others. So for today, looking at the rights of refugees and asylum seekers, looking at diversity in terms of inclusion of ethnic minority communities, and how we can do that going forward in a peaceful, non-violent way. And there are many stories of women pacifists as well as women activists in the past, which again is very interesting, that you have so many sides to what a woman is, and telling all those sides is important. And I might just finish up by saying that I think in terms of going forward, how do we continue to remember stories and to have ethical commemorations into the future where we can include alternative and silenced voices? And I particularly think that including women's voices is a way forward here. It would be great to get to a point where we have 50-50 equal representation in the stories we remember and tell, and to have 50-50 diversity of opinions and perspectives on women and other stories from key historical events in history. So I think remembrance and commemoration are very important, but to do so in a way that is about healing and uniting and promoting shared visions for a peaceful society. And as I was saying, I think that looking at stories of women as leaders, pacifists, activists, and campaigners from a diversity of perspectives is a way forward to do this. And just to say that Smashing Times are hoping this year to build a virtual online space where we're hoping to share the stories that we're currently gathering from women across Northern Ireland, and reclaiming those stories and maybe creating a different perspective on history and the narratives of history. And we'd love to have those stories shared with schools, with communities, with universities, and to have them celebrated at local levels, but also at national levels, which would be very, very important. And people can find information on all of our stories on the Smashing Times website, which is www.smashingtimes.ie. And for example, we have the digital art exhibition Women's Voices Then and Now, which I spoke about. We've got a book called Comet Lines, which is about stories of people in resistance during World War II. We've got a book called Women, War and Peace, which is about stories of women from the island of Ireland and from countries across Europe active during World War II. We're producing a book called Artists Against Fascism, which is a book telling stories of artists who stood up for fascism. And as I said, we're hoping this year to launch our virtual exhibition in October. And as part of that, we're hoping to display a series of stories of women from the decade of centenaries from Northern Ireland. And it will be very exciting to look at how those stories are going forward.